We continue now at the top of Daf Mem Dalet Amud Beis Meseches Baba Basra. This is Baba Basra Daf 44b. On the previous Amud, the Gemara was discussing the Brisa, which makes a distinction between a person who sells a house or a field to a lokeach. Then we say that the mocher is not allowed to testify to keep it in the hands of the lokeach. Let's say there's some ma'arer, somebody protesting that it never belonged to the mocher. In that case, the reason why the mocher is not allowed to testify is even if it's to no direct advantage. Let's say he sold it to the lokeach and he took no responsibility. Let's say it would get taken away. So there's no direct advantage to the mocher, but still there's an advantage to the mocher because there might be a lien on that property. We're talking about land. There might be a lien from a creditor of the mochers, and the mocher wants that loan should be paid off. Let's say the mocher can't pay off the loan. It's to his advantage. That's called ma'amida. He's setting it up ifnei bal chov before his creditor. Now that's not true. Let's say we're talking about metaltalin. Let's say it's a para, a cow, or let's say it's a talis that was sold to the lokeach. So there's no lien, and therefore there's really no advantage if the mocher took no achrayas on the sale. And the Gemara says we don't even need to say it in a situation where it's bistama, where there was nothing, it wasn't specifically designated, meaning the cow or the talis wasn't designated to the Baal Chov with a lien on it. Alo mishtab delay, there's not going to be a lien, there's not going to be a lien, so there's no issue. And the Gemara continues, my time, what's the reason? Metaltalin, because again, these are movable objects, so metaltali the Baal Chov, lo mishtabdi, and metaltalin, movable objects to a creditor, there's no lien on them, and so therefore again, there's no advantage to this mocher, he's allowed to testify. And the Gemara says even further, this is true, even if he writes for him that he's going to give him from the cloak on his shoulders, meaning he's specifically saying you can collect basically from anything. But hani mili disnu beinayu, that's only true if the metaltalin is be'ain, meaning it's in his possession. Avolesnu beinayu, but let's say he already sold it to somebody. Lo, so that wouldn't be true. There would be no lien on the movable objects in that case. And it's not only true in this situation. El afilu aso apotaki nami, even in a situation where he designated, he said that this para, this talis, I'm designating this specific para that you're going to collect from it, even there also, you're not going to collect in a situation where it's already been sold. And the Gemara says, my time, what's the reason? Kid Rava, it's like Rava said. The Yama Rava, because Rava said, Asa avdo apoteki, if a person makes his slave an apoteki, he designates that for collection, umachro, and sells the slave, Baal Chov gov mimenu. So by a slave, the Baal Chov does collect from it. That's true by a slave. However, shoro v'chamoro, however, let's say his ox or his donkey is an apoteki, if that's the designated thing to collect from, umachro, and then he sells it, ein Baal Chov gova himenu. The Baal Chov there does not collect from it. And the Gemara says, my time, what's the reason? Why do we make this distinction between an eved and a shor and a chamor? And the Gemara explains, Hai islay kala, because one of them has a kol. What that means to say is that people are aware of this particular slave, that there's an apoteki, that there's a lien over there, and therefore it's buyer beware, and we say that the creditor could collect from the buyer. However, v'hal leslay kala, but when it comes to a shore, people can't distinguish one shore from another shore. The word doesn't go out about this shore, and so therefore we say if it's sold already, then it's not going to be collected by the creditor from the lokeach, and that's why in a case of a shore, in a case of a situation of a regular movable object, so then we are going to say that the seller is allowed to testify to keep it in the possession of the buyer because he's not giving it to the creditor. There's no indirect benefit even for the seller in that situation. But the Gemara continues, V'leichash, but we should be concerned. Maybe there is some kind of benefit because Dilma Akni Le Metaltali Agav Mikarkoi. Maybe what he did was, he did essentially a Kinyan Agav to put a lien on this metaltalin. If he has some karka, if there's a lien on karka on land, he can then do a Kinyan Agav and say, just like we have a lien on the land, we also are going to have a lien on the metaltalin. And then you do have a situation where the seller can benefit if he testifies and keeps it in the hands of the lokeach, because there is a lien on the property that the creditor could collect from. Diyama Rabba, because Rabba said, Yakni le metaltali agav mikarkoi, if you do a kinyan of the movable objects through a kinyan agav with the land, meaning a kinyan along with the land, kani mikarkoi, kani metaltali, the kinyan works on the land and it works on the metaltalin. V'yomer Rav Chisda, and Rav Chisda says, V'hu dechasav le de lo kasmachtu de lo ketovsa de shtare. As long as when you write that up, you write that it's not going to be like an asmachta, means to say it's not going to be like an asmachta, because an asmachta would be a situation where you say, if I don't pay off, so then you'll collect from here. So you want to avoid asmachta, because usually asmachta doesn't work. So you write in specifically that it shouldn't be like an asmachta. You also write in there that it shouldn't be ketovsa de shtare. Ketovsa de shtare means they would have documents which were just there for the scribes to use to copy from. They weren't real legal documents. They were just used in order to write other documents. So it shouldn't be like that. It should be an official kind of part of the contract. But the point is, you do have a scenario where the creditor is able to collect from these metallics. metaltalin. And so therefore, in a situation, again, of a shore or talis as well, we should be concerned maybe this is the situation, and we shouldn't allow the mocher to testify. And the Gemara says, well, and here we're dealing with a case where we know that's not the case. What happened was, he bought the object and then sold it immediately. So in a situation where he bought and then sold immediately, we know for certain that there is no creditor who's going to have a lien on this particular property. But the Gemara still says, we should be concerned, maybe it's de'ikni. De'ikni means to say, even things I will acquire. Maybe there was a loan beforehand from a creditor, and they said, even things that I will acquire in the future, there's going to be a lien on. Shamat mina, should we learn from this, de'ikni kana umachar kana v'horish lo mishtabed, that in the case of de'ikni, if he purchases and then sells, or purchases and then gives it over to an heir, that there is no shibud. Maybe we should draw that conclusion, but that wasn't so clear in the Gemara later on in the Masechta. The Gemara leaves that as a question. And so the Gemara answers to that, lo no tzrich, it's necessary to amri edim, because witnesses say, yadinon bei bahai, we know about this person, to lo havale arameolim, that he never had any land. So you don't have to worry at all that there's a kinyan agav, because he never had any land to do a kinyan agav with. So again, we know for certain there's no shibud on this metaltalin. But the Gemara continues, V'amar Papa, didn't Rav Papa say, Afagav da'amar Rabbanan hamocher sadal l'chaver shelo ba'achrayis, even though the Rabbanan say that if a person sells a field to his friend and takes no responsibility, uba bal chov v'tarfa, and if a creditor tries to come and collect, eino chozer olav, so then he has no responsibility. He doesn't, the lokeach can't go back to the seller to be reimbursed. But nimtzis she'ena shelo, but if it's found out that it's not his at all, chozer olav, the lokeach actually is allowed to go back to the mocher. Meaning to say, you're trying to say that he has no self-interest because he sold it without taking responsibility. That just means there's no responsibility if a creditor comes along and takes it from the lokeach. But he certainly should be responsible if he never owned it at all, if there's a ma'arer, and so therefore there certainly is a self-interest. And the Gemara says, no, hachab ma'askin, and here you have to say, what's the case? B'makir bosh hi bas chamoro. The case is, the buyer also recognizes that this was the daughter of his donkey. What it means to say is the buyer recognizes that, no, he was an owner over here, and so they're not really contesting that particular issue. The buyer's not going to go back to the seller and say you never owned it, because the buyer already admits that he was the owner, and so therefore, again, there's no self-interest in that regard. And the Gemara continues, Rav Zavid Amar, but Rav Zavid says, Afilu nimtzas she'eno shalo, eno chozer olav. It's not true. Even if we find out that it's not his, even let's say there's a ma'arer and says it never belonged to the seller, and that ma'arer takes it away from the lokeach, even in that case, there was no achrayis, and therefore the mocher is not responsible. The seller says to the buyer, the mocher says to the lokeach, that's why I sold it without taking achrayis, I have no responsibility. And the Gemara continues, Gufa, returning to what we said above, Amar Ravin bar Shmuel mishmei de Shmuel. Ravin, the son of Shmuel, said in the name of Shmuel, Hamocher sadal l'chaver shelo b'achrayis. If somebody sells a field to his friend and takes no responsibility, still, even though you would think he has no interest, ein meid lo aleh, he still can't testify about it to keep it in the hands of the lokeach, memnei shema'amid b'fnei bal chovo, because again, he's allowing this to be now something that the creditor, that his creditor could collect from, so there is this kind of indirect interest that he has, that he wants it to stay with the lokeach. And the Gemara says, hey, Chidami, what exactly is the case? And we will continue with this discussion in the next video on Daf Mem Hey Amud Aleph.